Okay. Hi, Rich. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing great, Doug. How are you?
Oh, good. Thank you. Thank you for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me, man. I'm excited.
So, I got another comic book guy. I've had a couple of you comic book guys on this show before.
I hope that's a good thing. I mean, well, you invited me on, so I guess your experience must have been okay with the last comic book guy.
Oh, yeah, I love comic book guys. They're just like overgrown kids, basically. So, your comic book is called Cult of Dracula. Is that the series?
That is correct. Yeah, it's Cult of Dracula. It's out now from Source Point Press. Issue 5 actually hit shelves today, conveniently enough. And there's one more issue to come in August in the Cult of Dracula series. And then we'll be following that up with Rise of Dracula in January of 2022 and Reign of Dracula in January of 2023.
Okay, are these, I mean, obviously most people know who Dracula is or was. Are these very dark, or is there some sort of lighter side to it, or what's the mood?
Oh, it's sunshine, lollipops, and rainbows from page one. No,
Seriously.
it is a very it's a very dark horror book. I'm a huge horror fan. That's been my favorite genre of book, television, live play, whatever. That's been my favorite genre my entire life. So when I was writing Cult of Dracula, I wanted to write something that I would be proud of as a horror fan. And so hopefully horror fans will identify with the comic and see that it reflects and represents the things that they hold dear. So yeah, this is a book written by a horror fan for horror fans.
Now, is comic books, are they online or print or both?
Both. Print is the dominant form of presenting comic books. Somewhere around 95, 96% of all comics are read in, book form. And digital is growing, but I don't know, there's something about having a physical book in your hand that comic book fans really connect to. Digital, you just can't get that. You can't get that on an iPad or a Surface Pro or whatever. It just doesn't translate. And forget about reading a comic book on a phone. That's a miserable experience. Because the art's so tiny and it's just difficult. But yeah, so Cult of Dracula is out right now in paperback form, in floppy form in comic book stores all over the country, and you can also go to Comixology and find it, or whatever your favorite digital format is, you can find it there. And soon it'll be a collected edition trade paperback.
I'm happy to hear that comic books have not suffered the dramatic decline or alterations that many other media content formats have with the advent of digital. It seems like
Hmm.
that it's actually it's actually done as well or better. I mean, is the comic book market as big now as it was, say, in the 1950s?
I think it's bigger than it was in the 50s. It's not quite as large as it was in the 90s, but it is definitely still a strong and growing market. With all of the comic book adaptation movies and television shows, that's really helped the medium. And I think also digital has helped the medium to grow, because a lot of people, it's very difficult to go and buy a copy of Amazing Fantasy 15 or Detective Comics 27. So the average person's not ever actually going to be able to read those books in book form, but they can find them digitally. And what I've noticed, I'm also a comic book retailer. I own a store in Knoxville, Tennessee. And what I've noticed is a lot of people will start with digital and they'll read some of the older things that are more difficult to find. They'll read those digitally, and then they'll come in and they'll kind of start their journey with the hobby, kind of shifting to the printed form. So I think digital's been a really good thing for the comic book industry.
I would also contend that digital has probably helped the comic book industry in terms of marketing.
I would agree with that. Yeah.
Because, like you said, people start with the digital. They find what they're looking for digitally, and then they can order the print.
Yeah, because comic books can be, it's not an easy hobby to get into. It can be very intimidating. You know, when you're looking like Action Comics, for example, is well over 1,000 issues now. And so people that are new to the hobby, they come in and they look at that and they're like, oh my gosh, it's up to issue 1,038. I can't read that many comics just to know what's going on. So people are intimidated by those large numbers. You know, so I think with digital, especially providing collected editions and things like that digitally, that kind of eases people in and they can see, oh, I don't have to go all the way back and read the very first Superman book. I can pick it up anywhere in the series with a different story arc. And as long as I know who Superman is and know the basics of the character, you know, you could start reading it right now with Action Comics, you know, 1,038 or whatever. You know, you don't have to go all the way back to the beginning. And I think digital also helps people get over that intimidation a little bit.
Now, your series, Cult of Dracula, is it a series, or would I need to start at #1, or are they standalone?
So, Cult of Dracula is a series of 6 collected issues. Or 6 monthly issues, excuse me. So it is one that you definitely would want to read from issue 1 through 6. You know, because jumping in at issue 4 or 5, you would lose a lot of the story. You know, if you can't find 1, 2, and 3, then you may want to wait for the trade paperback, which comes out in October, and that's going to collect the entire story in one book. So Cult of Dracula is the first of 3 volumes of a Dracula saga that I'm writing. I hate using that word saga. It sounds very pretentious, but it's really the only thing that works. So it's part 1 of a 3-part saga. Now you would be able to read Cult of Dracula and then skip to Reign of Dracula if you wanted, or you could read Rise of Dracula and then go back and read Cult, because they're, you know, they take place at different time periods and they're a connected story, but they're not necessarily a sequential story.
So the process is, you are the writer, so you actually write out the story. Somebody else does the animation, I assume?
Yeah. So I'm working with an artist by the name of Puis Calzada. Puis is based out of Mexico City. He is a brilliantly talented artist. He's done quite a bit of work in the horror genre, and we've been working together since issue 3, and we're going to continue working together on Rise of Dracula and Reign of Dracula. So it's been a great experience to work with Puis.
So you write the story and then send it to him, and then he will do the illustrations?
Yeah, I write it out as a script. The way I write comic book scripts is very similar to writing a screenplay. You know, I break it down by scenes and pages, and you know, each panel is kind of like a shot, like you would be describing it to a director of photography if you were making a film. And you know, I write the descriptions as detailed as possible and send it over to Puis, and he interprets what I've written and turns it into these beautiful images on the page.
So the dialogue, when one is writing a comic book, the dialogue, like you said, the reference to screenplay, has to be fairly minimal, right?
It can be. I mean, there are comic book writers like Brian Michael Bendis, who is well known for dropping walls of text on a reader. You know, comic book fans tend to not like that. You know, because if they wanted to read a book, they would read a book, but they read comics because they kind of want a bridge. You know, they want something kind of in between. My approach, I don't use a lot of exposition. I don't use a lot of like voiceovers, thought boxes. I do use dialogue quite a bit, but you know, I don't over explain things to the reader. Sometimes that works out well, sometimes not so much. Cult of Dracula is not a book that you can just, skim through in a few minutes. It's one that you actually have to read, and you have to really examine the artwork, what's going on in the panel, to give you all of that exposition and context that you need. So, there are Cult of Dracula #1 opens up 8 full pages with one line of dialogue in 8 pages. So, I do like to use dialogue sparingly, so that when I do use it, it's impactful and it's something that the reader knows they need to pay attention to because it's important.
Let me ask you something about learning how to do this. If I had a child that really wanted to be doing what you're doing, where do you start?
You start by reading. I'm not sure who said this first, but a writer who writes more than he reads is a bad writer. So I 100% agree with that. I would highly recommend that you start that child out reading as many comics as possible. That way you can familiarize yourself with the format and the style, and learn what other people have done before you, and then add your own personal touch to that. You don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you do this. The other thing, what I would say, is for anybody that wants to get into comic books, this is something that you absolutely can do. If I'm sitting here, Cult of Dracula is closing in on about 150,000 units sold now worldwide.
Great.
So if I can write a book that sells that many units, trust me, anybody can, because there is absolutely nothing special about me. I'm just a kid from Middle Tennessee who liked scary movies and decided to write a scary story. So I would be very encouraging to anyone who wants to get into the comic book world, but I would also temper that with the understanding that it is a lot of work. It takes a lot of commitment and a lot of discipline to complete a script, and you've got to have a collaborative mindset. People who are dictators, and who have to have everything their way, I don't think they do as well in this industry, because you do have to work. The writer has to work with a penciler and an inker and a colorist and a letterer and a cover artist and an editor. There's a lot of people that contribute to making a comic book happen. So you do have to have that collaborative mindset if you're going to be successful.
It really is more like making a film than writing a novel, isn't it?
It really is. That my background, I have degrees in theater and film, and my career path, my intended career path, was to be a screenwriter. So I was very familiar with writing screenplays, and so shifting to the world of comic books, it's very, very similar. And producing a comic book is very similar to producing a film, because you just like in a film you'd have a director of photography, you have a penciler in this, you'd have a set dresser or a set designer in a film. In the comic book world, you have your colorist. So all of these moving parts and all of these people have their input into the product. Whereas, writing a novel, I imagine that's something you could lock yourself in a basement and just write and not have to talk to anybody.
I would say that's certainly more true. The one thing that I found interesting about screenplay, I've done one full screenplay and one TV sort of series. When I sent them to people for critique and review, the first thing that I got back was all of the formatting errors.
Oh, God, I know.
Yeah. Rather than just, is it a good story? Okay, sorry, I didn't put a colon here. Is comic book writing that pedantic about formatting to write?
Not at all. The one thing I was very surprised to learn, and like you, I came from a screenwriting background, so I'm accustomed to being obsessed with formatting. And you're right, where do I put the colon? How many spaces do I include from the margin? Blah 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 blah.
Right, right.
All the way down to if you don't use the right font, people will just throw your script in the trash, which is ridiculous, especially in the modern age that we live in. It's silliness and gatekeeping. But in the world of comic books, one of the things I learned very early on from talking to other people, other writers, was that there really is no right or wrong way to compose a comic book script. There's no set format. Some people write their scripts out to be very much like outlines, with vague details that just allow the artist to interpret as much of the visual as they can. Other people are, very, very hyper detailed. They write it out like they're writing a novel and leave it up to the artist to interpret. And then there are people like myself and many others who write it out like screenplays, which is kind of something in the middle where, I have an input on the structure of the page, how many panels, et cetera, and what details are going to be in those panels. But then it also leaves the artist plenty of room to interpret. And, Puig is very good at the way he lays panels out. And I'm total garbage with that. It's just not something that clicks with me. If I were left to my own devices, I would probably end up with 25 pages of 5 panels each, just rectangles stacked on top of each other, which is very boring. So having someone like Puig who's able to figure out how to arrange the panels on the page in an interesting way that carries the story forward, but also appears dynamic. We've been able to create a very cinematic feel to Cult of Dracula, and that's all thanks to my collaboration with a brilliantly talented artist.
Well, that's super. Well, Rich, we got to wrap this up. We are out of time. Do you have a website you want to give out?
Absolutely. You can visit cultofdracula.com, or on social media, you can go to Facebook/Cult of Dracula Comic. It's the same thing on Instagram, and on Twitter, it's @CultComic.
Okay, great. Thanks so much.